Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, aneighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Today we have another Things Hidden podcast in store where we're going to have a deep dive into kind of the anthropological foundations of current events that we're processing in real time. And to do so, we have a returning guest, the host of the Martyr Made podcast, someone who's quite a gifted historian and his ability to capture the details of very complicated events in history and to do so with great enthusiasm. Darryl Cooper, how you doing, sir?
Good. It's good to be back on. Good to talk to you.
Yes, and you and I share an interest in mimetic theory and Rene Girard's work, and of course, this podcast likes to focus on that framework a lot for a toolkit to look at current events, although we go into different fields of interest. But I thought, it'd be great to have you on with all of the emotionalism surrounding what's going on in the Middle East, to take a step back and use a kind of dispassionate toolkit like mimetic theory as a touch point to help us process the information and facts, the history of things. I was struck by a comment you made on your Twitter page recently where you said the more people, go into the deep dive of history, like the current conflict with Israel and Palestinians, the more they actually do the deep dive with you, the more they come back and say, hey, I'm sorry for calling you names. I realize actually I have a lot more empathy for my opponents than I had before. So there's something almost therapeutic in some sense, or let's say purgative, about doing proper history that many folks like to avert their gaze from, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every country has certain historical myths, historical events, points in their own history that get mythologized because they're fundamental to the national identity, or just the collective identity in general. If it's not a nation state, we have these. The American Revolution is one, although that is sort of becoming demythologized because it's losing its. So much of the American population that's here now is descended from people who came after the revolution. That has sort of lost its force to a certain extent. But the Civil War, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement are three other examples of historical events that are extremely complicated in their causes, with heroes and villains on both sides, with very complicated and motives on all sides, just a lot of things going on, just like any historical event. But that's not how those three events tend to get talked about, because they're sort of fundamental to our collective identity right now as a society. And Israel obviously has these things, and so do the Palestinians, and both of them are rooted in mutual grievances that are inevitable whenever you've had a blood feud going on for, over a century now, I guess, going on a century at least, with mass atrocities, countless mass atrocities committed by both sides against the other. A lot of suffering in relatively small societies. 3,000 people died in 9/11. Got 300 million people in the United States. 1,400 Israelis got killed, and there ain't that many of them. It's a big event. And the same when the retaliations come and Palestinian civilians are killed. And so both sides have a long list of grievances that, when you dig into them, are mostly valid on both sides. And it when I say that people who learn more about it become empathetic to the other side, that really it applies to partisans of both sides. I've had Zionists in different parts of the world and Israelis, including IDF soldiers serving active duty, who wrote after listening to my podcast to say that it opened them up a bit to what the Palestinians had gone through. And I've heard from Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims in different countries the same thing about gaining sympathy for the situation, the desperate situation that the Jews were facing, and their need for a home that kind of drove their behavior. But yeah, when you have two societies whose really fundamental self-understanding and the thing that sort of holds them together as a society is rooted in grievance and suffering, then you find yourself in a mimetic conflict that's very difficult to break.
Yeah, that's definitely what we're observing here, and it seems almost intractable given the situation. I had Scott Horton on last week, and he kind of traced the nuts and bolts of the different dynamics of the politics and that dispute, and the different settlers that are already, all over the West Bank, and how this kind of makes it very difficult to have a two-state solution, or these different things can be very difficult.
Virtually impossible
Yeah.
without forced repatriation of hundreds of thousands of very committed settlers who in the past have been willing to riot and fight with Israeli security forces, their own country's security forces, whenever they have been evacuated in even small numbers. And so what that means is it's not going to happen. Right. There's no political appetite for anything like that in Israel. And anyway, no political faction, even if Netanyahu were to start ordering all of the settlers out of the West Bank, he's basically the new David Ben-Gurion. He's been prime minister for most of my life, it seems like. And yet there is no political faction in Israel with the power, let alone the will, but not even the power to repatriate those settlers. And so when you look at a map where the settlements are in Palestine, the territory is so broken up that the idea of coming up with borders of a contiguous Palestinian state, it's virtually impossible. And that's a part of the point of the settlements. That's it's one of the reasons that a lot of the settlements are where they are, is specifically to make that solution impossible.
And then, of course, the one-state solution sounds even more far away, right? I mean, in some sense, right? So what solutions are left on the table? We're going to get into the mimetic dynamics here, but I mean, is there any silver lining here that to have any hope for this situation, realistically?
Well, I mean, right now, you have to for there to be a solution, I guess. Both sides have to see it as being in their interest to come to a settlement that the other side can live with. And the problem is, if you look at this from the Palestinian perspective, every settlement that is remotely acceptable to even liberal Israelis amounts to the Palestinians ratifying their own ethnic cleansing and sort of saying all is forgiven and it's water under the bridge that happened. Every settlement that's remotely acceptable to most Palestinians amounts to compromising the idea of a Jewish state as an ethno state or a religious state, however you want to put it, to an extent that it would make the Jewish state more or less untenable. One state solution is obvious. If they were to bring the Gazans and the West Bank Palestinians and other Palestinians around the world who wanted to repatriate once the solution was put in place, Jews would be a minority in that new state of Israel. Now they could go to some sort of Swiss binational, state where there are various solutions, but they would all amount to Jews living within the confines of a state as a minority again, and that's just not something that they're willing to do. And when you look at what happened a couple weeks ago, the Hamas attack a couple weeks ago, there's not a lot you can say. I mean, even somebody who is really critical of Israeli behavior toward the Palestinians and the settlements and the military occupation and everything else, there's very little you can say to somebody who says, you want us to allow these people who just did this to have a state next to us where they can have a military, where they can develop nuclear weapons, if they want to, or what? No way we're doing that. And it's really hard to respond to that too. And so right now there's the incentives are just not set up for peace. The Gazans especially, their lives are so degraded in that city. And you're talking about a territory that I'm sure you probably went through all this stuff with Scott, but you're talking about a territory that is surrounded by a wall, patrolled by robot machine guns, remotely controlled robot machine guns that are pointed inward toward the inmates to keep them in. And that's the state of life for the people in Gaza. The Israelis patrol the skies. They surveil the whole place, probably the most heavily surveilled place on Earth. They control how much food and what food and medicine and construction materials and so forth are allowed into Gaza. The Israelis control that. And so the people in Gaza, you see in the West, people who really want radical political change in the West will often say, well, it hasn't gotten bad enough here for that yet. People are just too comfortable. And when, you're waking up in a comfy bed and you have enough to eat and everything else, it's really hard to get motivated for revolution. And that's totally true. There's a totally different calculus for the people in Gaza. Their lives, if you're a young dude in Gaza, you're not thinking, which university do I want to go to, and which career do I want to choose? None of that exists for you. And so your calculations of your future prospects are very different. And it's why, whenever they poll young kids, school kids in Gaza, and they ask them what they want to be when they grow up, a plurality at least always say they want to be a martyr, because that's the way to achieve status and feel like you've become somebody in the context of a society that's totally subsumed by ressentiment, And I just don't think there's an appetite for peace. I think the Gazans and the Palestinians in general, especially the Gazans, though, are willing to accept the suffering, thinking that in the long run, their demographic advantages and everything else will lead them to victory. And I think that the Israelis, partly because of the the role of the United States in the region. I'm convinced that if the United States was not involving itself in this conflict over the decades, that the Israelis would have come to an agreement with the Palestinians and the Arabs long time ago, because they would have had no choice. The U.S., ever since '67, we've really just, we just pick sides in the conflict. We've just thrown our entire weight behind the Israeli side. Anytime there's a Security Council resolution calling on Israel to, remove some of the settlements or something, we veto it. Doesn't matter what it is. And Israel kind of knows that it can assassinate Iranian scientists, and it can hit the Syrian airport, the Damascus airport, and kind of do whatever it wants. Because if Syria or Iran or any of these countries attack Israel, they know that 6 aircraft carrier groups are gonna show up in the region really fast, and so it's disincentivized them from wanting to compromise. And the other side is obviously disincentivized for other reasons.
Right. And then, so what was Hamas's motive for doing the kind of heinous attacks on civilians? What can you, the mission was called the Al-Aqsa flood that they engaged in. What do you think they were trying to provoke or do here? They just wanted to kind of sabotage the different peace deals that were going on with the Abraham Accords and so forth like that? Or was there something else specifically they had in mind here?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, you have to, there are a couple of questions that I am not fully clear about the answers on. And, one of them is how much tactical control any kind of central Hamas command has over its fighters in an operation like this. Like, there are groups where you just look at, think of like a BLM riot or something like that. Like, there's an organization called BLM. Some of the people who are affiliated with that organization may have promoted and put together this march, but then it devolves into a riot, and there's no command and control being exercised over people. That just doesn't exist. At that point, you realize that although these people are united and marching together, holding the same signs and chanting the same slogans, that really this is a bunch of individuals and small groups who are there kind of doing their own thing and who are going to do what they're going to do regardless. I don't know how much that applies to what's going on with Hamas, whether they could be a sort of really just like a rallying thing that gets the young men really amped up and ready to fight, and like, all right, now let's go do it. And they all go do it. Obviously there was some general coordination, you're going to take the hang gliders and we're going to break down the fence with the bulldozers and all that. But like, once they're in there, these might just be a bunch of crazy young dudes who are super amped up on on a lifetime of heavily indoctrinated hate programming, who once you get them over there, and these are also people who know they're about to die. That's the thing too. All of those Hamas fighters who went into Israel, every single one of them, they didn't all die, but they all expected to die. None of them, it was a suicide mission. And so they get over there, and it could be that a lot of these, that nobody at Hamas said, okay, we want to make this as gruesome as possible in order to do X. Like, that's possible. It's possibility. But it's also, so the other possibility would be that they do have some measure of control over their fighters, and the consistency of the barbarism that we saw in so many different locations, so many different people, shows that at the very least they're approaching the conflict from a similar place. Then you have to ask, like, okay, if the point was to be as gruesome as possible, because they're taking videos. Why would they take videos? Why would they kill babies? This isn't a population control thing, where if we just keep doing this over time, it'll, reduce it's not like that. The purpose of this was to produce horror. And if that's the case, then you have to ask what the motive of that would be. And, it can, I can only think of one thing, and that is that it was intended to provoke an overwhelming Israeli response. If you go back to 2014, when the last time Israel assaulted Gaza, 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and murdered by some Palestinians. And this was very different than the current attack, because there were actually like vigil marches for those 3 boys among the Palestinians in the West Bank. And even some, Hamas was denying responsibility for it and saying that, we didn't do this and so forth. Although there's at least questions about that. The people who did it were certainly affiliated with Hamas. But three teenagers got murdered. Shortly after that, a Palestinian teenager was kidnapped and murdered by some extremist Israelis. And then Israel went into Gaza and they devastated whole sections of that city over 3 dead teenagers. I mean, I think the UN count is about 2,500 dead, 10,000 wounded, but hundreds of thousands displaced, left without power, water, and so forth. And so obviously Hamas knows that the inevitable result, that even if Gandhi was in charge of Israel, was the prime minister of Israel right now, instead of Netanyahu, of all people, that it doesn't matter. That what the response to something like what Hamas did is mechanical at that point. And so that you have to imagine they were provoking an overwhelming response in order to do what groups like this have always done, which is to try to create empathy triggers that delegitimize the other side. And it's very interesting because I got to say, like, I'm actually pretty surprised. Like, I was pretty involved in all this back in 2014. I went to a couple marches at the federal buildings in Los Angeles that were, certainly not pro-Hamas or anything like that. They were well into the Israeli assault, and they were basically calling for a ceasefire. And I was following it very closely, and I was interested in it, but there was not a whole lot of, there wasn't the same kind of general interest that you see now, and certainly not the mix of publicly expressed opinions that you see this time. I mean, it's been kind of shocking that for the first time that I can ever remember in any conflict, the Israelis have been unable to control the narrative very well, even from the very beginning. I mean, like, Israel started coming in for criticism basically while the bodies were still warm. I mean, like, the attack had hardly finished, and people were already talking about the occupation and the settlements and what causes violence like this, these are all obviously important conversations to have. They're maybe not conversations to have in the immediate wake of the worst attack that, civilian attack that Israel suffered in its history. But even despite that, despite the scale and the barbarism of the attack, Israel was not really given any, like, I was in a conversation with Jocko, and when this first started, and one of the things I said to him is that Israel is kind of on the clock right now. Like, they know that what's going to happen, because it happened in 2014, it happened in 2006, it always happens, is that at first people say, okay, these Israelis were killed, they got to do something, and they're given some leeway to act. But then after a few weeks, the images of the dead Israelis haven't been on the news in a few weeks, and all you're seeing is Palestinian babies being pulled out of the rubble and all that it just changes. And pretty soon, and it only took a few weeks really in 2014, the worm turned against Israel, and they eventually just had to sort of pull back without accomplishing a whole lot. other than a lot of destruction. And this time they didn't even get a week. I don't know if they got a couple days. I mean, and it's really remarkable. It's the first time I can remember seeing that happen. So there's definitely like there's a different mimetic process operative out in that's affecting global opinion, especially opinion in the West, but really everywhere. There's a different mimetic dynamic that was not very powerful or didn't exist until just a few years ago, I think.
Do you think that's largely, the Netanyahu's alliance with Trump and the kind of, politicization of the Israeli cause and in terms of the American media, or is that
Certainly,
not enough of a
well, certainly a lot of Israelis would say that. I've heard it from many Israelis, and they were saying it even at the time. When back, you remember back during the Obama administration,
yeah,
Obama was about to make the deal with Iran, and the Republican Party only, the Republican Senate invited Netanyahu to come over and give a speech denouncing the policy of the American president before the Senate. And he came in and he was treated like royalty. I mean, he came in and got more standing
yeah.
ovations than Obama had gotten the same year in the State of the Union address, right? And this was entirely done by one party. And there were people in Israel saying, Netanyahu, don't do this. Are you crazy? Like, we can't have Israel become a partisan issue in the United States. That's a disaster for us. But that is to a certain extent what he's done. And Trump obviously accelerated that by identifying himself so closely with sort of American Zionism
But
to the point where,
what's
yeah, go
ironic
ahead.
about it though is that within the conservative movement, one's proximity to fidelity to Trump is more likely to be a factor in being somewhat skeptical of the Israeli policy and its reaction to this attack. You know what I mean? So it's funny
Yeah,
how
that's a
it
good
cuts
point.
both ways. Trump's influence here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I hadn't actually thought about that, but it's true, and that is something interesting to consider.
So Trump's polarization's really made a big impact here on the at least in the and maybe even to the world stage, the fidelity of public opinion towards Israel's position when they get attacked like this. So I mean, he's really dropped their favorability. In other words, not only because he was aligned with Netanyahu so publicly, which soured the left's mimetic reaction to him, but then I guess that some of that has carried over now, but also because of his because of his fixation on personal loyalty, right? And he felt really, um, betrayed by Netanyahu for being the first to congratulate, I guess, Biden, and he refused to criticize Biden in that one phone call he had when Trump said he was still trying to count the votes to dispute it, and Netanyahu had already moved on, and he felt like, man, I really went to bat to give you everything you wanted, and Trump's stated worldview is I take care of you, you take care of me, and if you
Yeah.
don't take care of him after he has taken care of you, he feels really slighted by that, and his his ability ability to go off script of the Republican orthodoxy for support for Israeli government with no questions asked has, I think, contributed to the kind of debate that's opened up within some of the Trump aligned right about how supportive they should be for Israel's policies here. So that's interesting. Really, he's done a number on their favorability on both sides, both ways there.
Yeah, that's definitely true. He's just acted as an accelerant to pretty much an accelerant for the polarization of any issue that he kind of got close to or became identified with.
Like we we
It's,
we we don't fully process how insanely radical it is that the Republican frontrunner is openly criticizing the president of it or the prime minister of Israel right after an attack. Like, that's insane. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
He's not,
yeah.
obviously he's not taking a anti-Israel stance. He's saying Hamas are savages and so forth. But and this wouldn't have happened. I would have stopped those guys. There's no way they could have done it with me. But he to take a such strong critical stance towards the Israeli prime minister, who's a right-wing Israeli prime minister, and he's the Republican nominee, front runner by a lot. That's completely uncharted.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think one of the things that that both attracts people to Trump and repels people from him is that he has this sort of almost animalistic kind of well, actually, let me backtrack a little bit. You were talking about how his sort of basic philosophy is I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And the thing is, that's a basic human. I mean, it's one of the fundamental means of that reciprocity is one of the fundamental ways that human individuals and societies sort of build trust and grow relationships. And it's the kind of thing that keeps it all together. This stuff is very deeply embedded in us, right? Where it's like if you're walking down the hallway and somebody's passing you coming the other direction and you say hello and they just look at you and keep walking and don't say anything, you're gonna get annoyed by that to some degree because there's an expected reciprocity that's supposed to come back. Same with like if you were to give somebody, if you and I were friends and you gave me a Christmas gift every year and I just never gave you a Christmas present or birthday present or anything, you're not going to keep giving me Christmas gifts forever. And there's a good chance that when you stop giving them, it's not going to be just pure indifference, that there's going to be some negative feeling there as well. And so everybody operates this way. I mean, there were whole tribal primitive economies that were based around gift giving. And you can say that kind of gift giving or the returning of compliments or you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, those are all examples of positive reciprocity.
Right.
There's negative reciprocity too, right? Which is I guess best captured just by the word revenge.
Right.
And Trump is somebody who, and again, revenge, reciprocity, like all these things, everybody operates according to these dynamics.
Right.
It's just, but Trump just wears them on his sleeve and it's all just right out there in the open, like just raw sort of he pulls the shroud off of things that are usually concealed by 2 or 3 layers, and everybody knows, like any politician is going to think of other politicians in terms of transactional relationships, right? Trump just does that completely openly, and it's sort of uncouth and it's considered sort of gauche to do that,
Well, that's a perfect segue to a more explicit application of Rene Girard here, right? Because so Rene Girard is very keen about understanding the dynamics of reciprocity, as you mentioned, positive mimesis, negative mimesis, and even positive mimesis can spiral into negativity very quickly, right? So he says, human beings are very keen, as you were alluding to hide the reciprocity of their behavior with different layers of formality and ritual and so forth, because we don't want to face it. Well, ancient tribal societies were terrified of undifferentiated, twins, for example. Identical twins would be a harbinger of, curses or despair that would spread throughout the community because of the monstrous, reciprocity of identity and that they kind of symbolized, and they were often killed because of that. And so when you look at what you're talking about with Trump, and the way he keeps a personal grudge, he doesn't stay but it's so funny because he can also bury a grudge faster than a lot of the other guys in politics
Totally,
too.
totally transactional. Yeah.
Right. And it makes him, I call him like God's apocalyptic narcissist, in the sense that his kind of childlike narcissism, because all those politicians I think are narcissistic in various ways and psychopaths and all this.
Yeah.
But I think his childlike narcissism unveils the psychopathic dynamics of politics all around him in a way that it's, pissing in the pool of politics is what he's doing. And everybody can see it. And it kind of ruins the effect. And
you saw this right at the very beginning in one of the earliest Republican primary debates. You remember when he was talking about I think it was the first one, and everybody, this is what just, it made him extremely appealing to disaffected Republicans when he was what did he say? Something about how all of these people on stage, he had donated to all these people, and they had done what he wanted, just like little puppets. And like he's like, yeah, I drop coins into the Hillary Clinton machine. I drop coins into all these machines, and they all do what I want because that's what they're about, and I'm not about that. And people were like, wow. And yeah, absolutely, he unveils it for sure.
So in that sense, he's kind of the most political atheistic political figure we've had, or not in his intention necessarily, but rather just the way he performs as a performance artist. He's kind of the Andy Kaufman of politics here. He's kind of revealing the anti-comedy of it all. And for example, like the reciprocity of his relationship with Netanyahu, the fact that right after, it's just him, it's just who he is. Right after this horrific attack, he's still got to dig at Netanyahu and his supporters because they're so loyal to him because of his martyr's energy that he's received because of the indictments and all the other stuff that's been stacked against him. That kind of cruciform energy that humans get when they're in the public square and people feel like they're being unfairly scapegoated, as Gerard talks about, that scapegoat power, the victim power. That plays into this currency that he has, that he can break sacred cows, like, criticizing the prime minister of Israel a few days after a horrific attack. And in a party that's dominated by, evangelicals and Christian Zionism and so forth, and yet he's still getting, massive support, doesn't even make a dent on him because he's got all this built-in, identity with the folks who feel like they've been left behind and forgotten by political power in America. And so he can get away with saying things. And the reciprocity factor, I think, is interesting because Renee talks about, when you give gift giving, like if you give someone a nice pen, the ritual to hide the reciprocity is you don't buy like the same exact pen but a different color and give it to them the next week when you see it.
You'd think it was like, am I messing with you or somehow insulting your gift by doing this?
But you can't. It's like a trick. You can't give something too cheap as a return gift. Like, they buy you a very nice pen, and then the next week I see you, Darryl, I buy you a McDonald's. It's kind of like, that's what you got me for Christmas or whatever. It's kind of, so that can be insulting. And of course, if you buy, if you give someone a nice pen, and then the next week they get you a Porsche, you're like, whoa, now you've humiliated me, right? So the gift giving ritual has to be very carefully situated with enough differentiation and the right dialed, enough, it has to have enough space between differentiation and undifferentiation for it to land as a successful reciprocal ritual, right?
And it's interesting because that's true of like the positive reciprocity, like gift giving, and it's the opposite with negative reciprocity, like revenge. You take revenge on somebody, it's almost not even worth doing unless they know that you did it. Like you want to be very public, at least to the person that targeted, that this is why I did this, and that I've taken my revenge. And something that you don't hide at all. In fact, you'll go out of your way to to put into the world. And these are things that I think over here in the West, very obviously, especially Northwestern Europe, Anglosphere types, very individualistic, and we don't understand the dynamics or the logic of a blood feud very well. And
it's honor culture, right? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. And the Israelis and Palestinians both understand it very well. It's you're talking about people whose identity is distributed horizontally, let's say, more than it's distributed vertically, and they a lot more of their self-concept is distributed among the other members of their group and the group itself, so that collective responsibility, which is something that we just find absolutely abhorrent, like the idea that you're going to exact reprisals from just a general population because they're part of the group that did something to you, that's just totally unacceptable in a society that focuses on the individuals who are going to be affected. But when the emphasis is more on the collective, that's just not the case. And that's how it always was in traditional societies. It's still how it is to a large extent in Arab societies, where if you kill my cousin, it's not just considered okay for me to then kill you. If I find your cousin, I can kill him. And then because I did that, any one of your cousins can kill any one of my brothers or something. And like this is the cycle, the blood feud. Everybody is trying to a blood feud is meant to shape the behavior of another group, right? Like your actions in a blood feud. It's not a means for achieving justice, which is the way we think about these things. Right. These are survival mechanisms that evolved over long periods of time for how groups can survive without the presence of a strong state imposing dispute resolution mechanisms on everybody. Resolution of a blood feud requires leadership from both sides. That's one of the traditional roles of the elders in tribal societies, including like Arab and Bedouin societies. The sheiks were the elder statesman types who had enough respect, not only among their own people, but in general, like even among other groups, that if your family is getting into a feud with a family from another tribe and you're risking something that's going to expand and draw all of us into this big conflict, that this elder has enough honor in the society and enough respect to go to you and tell you need to cool it and you need to accept the restitution that the other side is offering. And it's all still voluntary in a tribal society. You don't have to do it, but the whole point of that elder is that he has enough respect in the society that if you don't do it and he has asked you to, then you're gonna suffer social penalties that'll make it not worth doing that. And the problem, one of the problems anyway that you see in the Israel-Palestine conflict is that there are no mechanisms for dispute resolution that both sides buy into, or at least that they're both compelled to submit to and accept. They just don't exist.
And America tries to be the policeman, but they're obviously a crooked cop, so they don't work as a mediator.
I mean, look, like you have like the Israelis point out that the Arabs refused to accept the UN General Assembly's vote in 1948 that partitioned Palestine. They refused to accept that. Therefore, they are sort of responsible for all this. How could they not accept this UN resolution? But then, of course, there have been countless General Assembly votes against the Israeli settlements and various other things to do with their behavior in the West Bank and Gaza. And the Israelis just denounced those as this organization is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic and totally illegitimate. We don't have to listen to this. And then the Palestinians do the same thing, right? They say, look, all of these the UN General Assembly said you have to get those settlements out of the West Bank and so on and so forth, return to the 1967 borders. And then when you tell them, well, yeah, the UN also partitioned the country in half and gave the Zionists this part of it, they're like, oh, well, yeah, that's, there were countries that were bribed to make that happen, so on and so forth, all of which is true. But the point is, there aren't any overarching dispute resolution processes that everybody buys into. And so when that's the case, you don't have any means to de-escalate, any recourse but violence. Like people have probably heard about or seen in documentaries or movies how when the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan, or I guess they are in control now again, they would have during soccer games, before and after soccer games in the big stadium there in Kabul, they would carry out executions in front of all the people. And there's this one story Dexter Filkins tells where he's been invited as a guest. This is like 1998, 99, something like that. So before 9/11. And he's over there reporting in Afghanistan, and he's a guest of the Taliban, and they're treating him fine. And they invite him as a guest to come sit on the 50-yard line. I don't know what the soccer people have, but basically sit on the grass on the 50-yard line and observe this judicial proceeding that's about to take place. And so one guy comes out and sentence is pronounced on him for stealing something, and they cut off his hand. But then a pickup truck comes in onto the field, and there's a guy in the back who's bound and blindfolded, and a bunch of armed Taliban guys in and around the truck who are coming up. And so they bring him out and they say, this man killed this other man. They bring the other man's family out, the dead man's family out. And the other side, the killer's family, approaches his family, and this is all sort of ritualized. They approach the other family and they ask the family to spare their son, and they'll offer, whatever, however many goats or whatever the restitution would be. And the family has the opportunity to accept that and squash the beef, or they can refuse it, but the beef is also squashed, and the Taliban are the enforcers of that squashing. And so in this example that Filkins gave, the family was not accepting the restitution, and the son, the brother of the dead man, was given the AK-47 to execute the guy right on the field. And then the Taliban announced to everybody, and they do this in public, not for just pure gruesome reasons or entertainment reasons. It's because this is a tightly bound community where family relations are very widely distributed and so forth. And so they got everybody together in one place, and they're letting them all know that, okay, this is now over. This is done. This conflict is not going to go back and forth. And if it does, you're going to meet us, the Taliban, and you don't want that to happen. And so this is over. And so that's something that we would look at as tremendously just barbaric and just over the top. But in reality, it's actually a civilizing mechanism, that is put in place. It's very primitive for sure, but that's how all of our society started out, with dispute resolution mechanisms like that. And when you have a situation like we've had in Palestine, where the power differential is so great, the relative level of oppression, I guess you could say, is so one-sided in favor of the Israelis. The Palestinians have been, look, they were ethnically cleansed in 1948. 750 to 800,000 of them were driven off their land at gunpoint, and they were not allowed to return, and they were herded into refugee camps, and their grandkids and great-grandkids still live in those refugee camps. And they don't have a state. They don't have any kind of sovereignty. They're not citizens of any state. It's probably the largest group of people in the world, certainly the largest group of people in the world, who do not fall under the protection of any state. And that's the position that they're in. And their opportunities for revenge inevitably feel inadequate, and they always invite an overwhelming tenfold response from the Israelis. And so that's a recipe for, the thing Nietzsche warned about, how when when you have reciprocity, let's say, that's too one-sided, like when someone is abused or repressed and they would like to take revenge, but they just don't have the power to do it, then that results in what he calls ressentiment. And that's really the state the Palestinians have been in for most of a century now. And Nietzsche lays out very well that is not it's not necessarily an admirable state of mind that produces good results in a human personality or a society. That we have this idea in the West, I think, that suffering ennobles people, that suffering or oppression sort of elevates someone to a higher moral position than somebody who's had it easy. And that's not rooted in nothing. There's something to that idea from a certain angle, but it's also important to recognize that suffering and weakness and just degradation can also turn people in very, very dark places, and when you've been involved in a blood feud for, again, going on 100 years, where, I mean, look, there have been massacres on both sides. There have been countless acts of straightforward terrorism carried out by both sides. If you go to Israel, it's one of the things that you find out over there that's just it really kind of makes it hit home, like how differently this feels to the people who are involved in the conflict over there, is that pretty much everybody you meet, not everybody knows somebody who was killed by a terrorist. Not everybody knows somebody who was injured by a terrorist. Everybody knows somebody who was affected by some of the violence. Like, it's a small enough society that you're never more than 2 degrees removed from the violence. And you just have to apply that to, and the same is true of the Palestinians. And so you have to apply that to our own, think of our, 9/11 really pissed off a lot of Americans, radicalized a lot of Americans, created a desire for revenge in a lot of Americans. And we can look at a lot of Americans and say, maybe this led you down some dark roads. Maybe you should have avoided that. Maybe you should not have let that take control of you the way it did. But if somebody said, no, my cousin died in that tower, then you'd probably shut up, because that person, they've sort of, I guess you could say, they've paid the price for the feelings that they have. And that describes everybody in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, you're talking about sacrifice, this concept of sacrifice and the different ways it manifests. That without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. This concept is an ancient concept.
Yeah, you must die so that we may live. Absolutely.
Caiaphas said about, executing Jesus, it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. But there's also this sacrifice. There's a sacrifice of another, and then there's a self-sacrifice. Those are intention in the biblical text, especially in the New Testament. But when you're talking about this person who has a relative that is killed in the 9/11 and the Twin Towers attacks, that's a kind of like a sacrifice in the sense that someone of their family member died, right? And as a kind of, and that in some ways gives them a kind of, like you said, sacrificial nobility by proximity. And this is something that, I've had on a guy named Richard Koenigsberg, who's tried to build on to some of the things Renee Girard said about sacrifice by suggesting that nations go to war to sacrifice their young men as a way of kind of proving the nation's sacredness, and kind of revivifying the nation's sense of sacred, unity, by how many of its young men it's willing to send off to be sacrificial, um, you know, vessels.
Mm.
And you can kind of see that at play a little bit in the reciprocity there in the Middle Eastern conflict. And this notion that, we were talking about positive reciprocity is fraught with danger. It can spill into negative. And negative reciprocity, of course, you can't, when you get caught up in these blood feuds, you can't look like a weakling. If they kill X amount of people, they've always, Israel or whatever is always going to have a bigger response and reaction. It can't just be the same amount of exact people that they kill in response. It's always got to be something. If it's not counted in people, it's got to be, catastrophic damage to infrastructure or buildings or something. It's got to look bigger.
Yeah.
It can't be an equally proportionate act of response. It's got to be something greater than that, which is
maybe that goes
phenomenon here.
Maybe that just thought of this. Maybe that goes to part of the answer to your question earlier about just the real brutality and savagery of the Hamas attack, and a lot of the attacks by PLO and PFLP and stuff before, where it's not just killing people, it's like it's purposely and publicly brutal. Is that the Israelis have the ability to take overwhelming revenge for anything that happens to their people by leveling whole city blocks, by flattening whole sections of Gaza City. The Palestinians don't have that option. If they want to take revenge that feels like they've gotten one up on, Israel can say you killed one of ours, we're going to kill 10 of yours. The Palestinians can't really do that. And so what they can do is they can up the level of savagery, though, and maybe there's something to that idea.
Right. I think so. And it's interesting. I want to talk about this from the Christian angle that Rene Girard brings to current events and helps us apply. It's interesting on 2 points. One, I like the way you mentioned that when you give a clear accounting of the record of the events, it cools off anger and violent aggression a little bit for those who have ears to see it, or ears to hear it and eyes to see the truth. And that's this Christian concept of history, that there's a transcendent truth that matters. It's not just about my tribe. It's not just about my ethnic loyalty and my emotions. There has to be an objective truth from God's vantage point. And of course, the Bible indicates that God's vantage point stands on the side of the victim in all of history. That means all the victims on both sides of any conflict, God's vantage point is found there, according to the biblical anthology. And that cultural framework has infected cultures in various ways to various degrees. And that's the framework by which we can even have a proper history, so to speak, in which there's an objective vantage point that is even attempted to be reached, in which a nation can go back and self-examine. Oh, this is the way we treated the Native Americans here. That wasn't right. Even though they were scalping people, but we were victimizing them, and this kind of atomic concept of self, and now, of course, it goes into self-flagellation, as humans always go into extremes. That's what I was going to say.
A lot of Israelis will say very openly to you that, look, I get it. Like, you want us to be over here wringing our hands about the Palestinians the same way you do about slavery and the Native Americans and everything. And I can even agree with you that there's something moral about that. And maybe one day we'll get there. But look at you people. Like, you people hate yourselves now. You can hardly get your country out of bed. Like, you're practically suicidal. And so we don't want that here, and we're not going to invite it. And I can understand that perspective. It's not sustainable, because eventually the truth always interrupts your plans. It's not sustainable, but I understand the impulse.
Right. you've got this this desire, this kind of mimetic rivalry for coveting the other's victim status, their victim power, right? There's this kind of never-ending tit for tat kind of grasping for the narrative to position themselves as the ultimate victim. And it's like it's the original victim Olympics in some sense, right? But this is at a much more violent scale.
And it's really interesting too. Maybe this has to, something to do with just the intractableness of the intractability of the conflict. Is that both sides obviously consider themselves primary victims, but one side, the side that is on top with their boot on the other side's neck, in a position of total control with regard to the immediate situation, at least, for historical reasons, still considers themselves to be history's greatest victims. And when you feel like a victim, I can't remember the word. I found it when I was doing my Israel-Palestine podcast, but there's even there's a Yiddish word that specifically meant a slave who became a king, and it's not a positive connotation. It's somebody who was a victim who has now been placed in a position of power, but still thinks of themselves as a victim, can justify just about anything that they want to do to people they perceive as victimizing them. And because it's really hard, and this is why Israel it's one of the reasons that Israel has really come in for criticism from the global left since the 67 war, is that it's become just increasingly untenable to continue to look at the Israelis as the victims in the situation. They're just so clearly more, they're just overwhelmingly strong and capable compared to the other side, that it's been harder to maintain that. And one of the things I've really found in conversation is that in diaspora Jews are much more like this than Israelis, in my experience. Israelis are not quite as tend to not be as focused on themselves as victims as much, and I think that's a natural response to having a country of your own and everything. But the diaspora Jews are often very, very attached to that idea. And so when you go back to like the 67 war, Israel obviously won a massive victory, occupied the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai and all that, and defeated all the Arab armies very easily. And overnight, basically, the global left turned against Israel and started looking at them as sort of an extension of Western imperialism in the Middle East and so forth. And Jews around the world, this is really what broke up the left in the 60s and 70s, and why it had to completely reconstitute itself later on, is so much of the leadership and the organizations and the money and stuff that were going into left-wing movements were coming from Jews and Jewish organizations. Like at the height of the civil rights movement, 65-70% of all the funding from for civil rights movement was coming from Jewish organizations. They're at the forefront of these things, and so they're a linchpin in the whole movement. Their organizing ability, the resources they could bring to bear, everything was so important to the left's success in the first half of the 20th century. And then the 67 war happens, and you start getting the third worldist types on the left, Black Panther types, all that, just the ones who are focused more on anti-imperialism and third worldism. They all turned on Israel, and the Jews these people were leftists, like all the neocons. They used to be Trotskyites, they're real leftists, and they were just absolutely shocked and could not understand how it was possible that these people they knew on the left, who were supposed to be for the victims, have turned against Israel. and they just didn't get it. They just, and I think to a certain extent, they still have trouble grasping that, because to them, Israel's the Jewish state. Jews are victims. That's who they are to a certain extent. Like if you take like there was a poll I saw a while back, several years ago now, where they were polling American Jews and asking them, what do you consider to be like the most important element of Jewish identity? And it was like affinity for the state of Israel, or the religion, Judaism, or what is it? And it was almost 70% said remembering the Holocaust. And so, that is an identity that's completely rooted in your own sense of victimhood, and a sense of looming danger at all times that is just always very present. And so to them, again, the Jewish state, it's synonymous with saying the victim state. The Palestinians, you call the Palestinians refugees. Like, no, we're the refugees. We're the ones who had to flee Europe and come here. And so that's the way they see it. And then the Palestinians, from their side, obviously have very concrete reasons to feel like they're the victims. Again, they're stateless refugees who are herded into camps patrolled by robots with, remote control machine gun robots. And so, they both have an identity that's very deeply rooted in their own sense of victimhood. And until both sides can learn to see themselves as the oppressor, to at least like a certain degree, or to see how others could view them that way, then it's really hard to imagine any progress being made.
And what you're saying, in other words, from a mimetic standpoint, is until both sides can anthropologically become Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the fact. I mean, we're not talking about separating the conversion to the, okay, everybody has to convert, that kind of thing. We're not necessarily saying that, but in some sense, anthropologically, they've got to learn the way of forgiveness with no strings attached, really.
It's something that Christians tend to have a lot of trouble understanding, that, to us, like, revenge is something that maybe you do it, but it's unsavory. It's not something you're proud of. It's not something that revenge is just, it's not a noble thing to do. Like, any Christian believes that if they take any of the gospel seriously. People, the Romans, back when Christianity was spreading, they thought that was crazy. Like, of course, right, you take revenge. I mean, Sulla had on his tombstone, let it not be said that I ever had a friend or an enemy that I didn't repay in full. And that was considered just a statement of his personal honor. And to the Jews and the Arabs who are over there, again, these people are not Christians. I'd say the Jews are, to a certain extent, influenced by Christian morality, but still they're not Christians. And revenge is not something that sort of has it doesn't carry the negative load that it does for a lot of Christians. And I think that's important to understand.
And yet you're talking about the Christian impact in the Roman culture. And I just came to mind something I've been talking about recently again, is this radical unveiling that takes place even with the culture of the Christians in their Lord's Supper, right? Where they're the Romans were fearful of these guys, cannibals. They're going out and eating their God in a secret room. What's going on? They're eating the body. What's going on around these people? They're saying they're eating the body of their hero, their Lord and Savior. And in some ways, it's a much more radical kind of unveiling than the same radical unveiling like what Trump does with the reciprocity being unveiled, right? Unveiling the root brutality and vulgarity of politics the way he does. But this one's an intentional unveiling that's much more shocking, in which, you're kind of exposing the heart of the sacred to the Roman ears and eyes. Oh, we are not like primitive cannibals. We are much more sophisticated than that. And the Christian Lord's Supper, in some sense, part of it is a kind of unveiling of the primordial origin of all sacred cults, including the Roman one, at its primary archaic form, which is cannibalism, which then becomes sublimated with all these sophisticated kind of detours into human and then animal sacrifices and Colosseum games and all these wars and all these bloodletting rituals that kind of are doing the same primordial thing at the very heart of the human derived sacred, which is this cannibalistic desire for the other's being, right?
Well, and that's the process of, like, that's the civilizational process, right? Is basically, the further you go back in the development of human civilization, you find people indulging these universal impulses in very direct ways. So there's human sacrifice, there's cannibalism, there's all these things. And as you civilize, become civilized, like, that's sort of synonymous with saying it's the same as saying that those people have found symbolic means to satisfy those impulses.
Right.
So I don't have to kill a person, I can kill an animal. I don't even have to kill an animal. I can actually just give some money or whatever it is, and actually satisfy that social and psychological requirement by doing that and have it actually work. And the decivilizational process is when all of those things sort of break down and lose their legitimacy, and you devolve back into the direct expression of those impulses, right? It's kind of, this is like the right way, I think, to read. I can't remember if Gerard talks about this. He must, that this is kind of the right way to read the Iliad. You know, we read it as a war story, like an adventure war story, sort of, but that's not how the Greeks would have read that story. Like, you know, the story of the Iliad is, you have a leader who exercises bad leadership. He takes Achilles' rightful prize away from him as like a sort of flex. Achilles has a right to be upset about that. He pulls his men out. He refuses to fight. The Greeks suffer defeats because of that. And all of the, you know, his friends coming to talk to him, friends coming to talk to Agamemnon, all of these, they're trying to get them to accept some form of dispute resolution that's standard in the society at the time. Yes, he's wronged you, but like, we need to get rid of this so we can move on and actually win this war. And both of them are refusing it, and the consequences for refusing it get worse and worse and worse, until by the time Achilles kills Hector, he's just devolved into a total barbarian. He's abusing his corpse, which was very, very verboten in ancient Greek society. He's got his corpse just sort of thrown haphazardly in a corner while they engage in a couple human sacrifices at the Greek camp. And this is something that any Greek reading that, the Greeks were well past human sacrifice by this point, and they would have considered it utterly barbaric. And they would have recognized immediately that, okay, what's happened here is these people have devolved down into a pre-civilizational state. And, you know, it's really interesting at the shield of Achilles. It's the shield of Achilles is described in very detailed way in the Iliad. And it doesn't have scenes of defeating foes and, you know, winning battles and being showered with rewards and gifts for all the things that you've done or anything like that. It depicts like a wedding scene. It depicts one man paying restitution to another man in like a court of law. It's all these civilizational things that allow us to not devolve into that primitive state that they did devolve into. And then the story ends in a sort of happy resolution, if you don't, you know, read the later versions that have the destruction of Troy. But the Iliad itself ends on a sort of a happy note where Priam comes and he asks Achilles to accept restitution, take this ransom, but give me back the body of my son. Stop abusing it. Stop all this. Give it back to me so I can go bury him in peace. And Achilles relents and he accepts the restitution. And so it's sort of the rage of Achilles is subsiding, and he's becoming a civilized person again. And you know, that's what civilization is. And when those things break down and all you have is revenge and all you have is is just direct indulgence of primitive impulses, then you end up with something like you see in Israel and Palestine.
And it devolves in different ways. It devolves in the return of attempts to scapegoat individuals, and it devolves into returns to, like you said earlier, have collective punishments for the sins of other individuals. Those are both forms of sacrificial decivilization. I think the January 6th thing is an example of moving in the direction of collective punishments. Like, because of your proximity to this figurehead Trump, we're going to give you decades for something that violent criminal mobs and the other team that's the officially designated mob of the establishment, they get nothing for. They get hardly any jail time at all, if at all. And that's,
I think, if anything, it's one of the more alarming things about this round of violence, is that the rhetoric I've seen from, obviously the rhetoric from the Hamas side is always what it is. We expect that, but the rhetoric from the Israeli side and from especially, I would even say, from supporters of Israel around the world we've sort of come down to a new level of dehumanization of Palestinian civilians, and a sort of shamelessness about the fact that what's happening right now is collective punishment of the civilian population for continuing to indulge the presence of Hamas, basically. The defense minister over in Israel, after they ordered a full siege, cutting off all power and water, food, and everything else, he said, "We're fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." And it's important to note that he was not justifying a military operation or a military tactic. He was justifying cutting off water, power, and food to everybody in that city. And so that's who he's calling human animals. This is a kind of a new thing that you've seen, that kind of rhetoric, especially, you see it at some level, like some Kahanist in the Knesset or something, but from the Israeli defense minister and from so many people around the world who support Israel, there's people who are doing all but justifying an Israeli genocide of the people in Gaza. And these are people who, a lot of them who in most cases, I would consider to be fairly reasonable, but this
other side,
conflict doesn't bring out the reason in people. So
there's Palestinian supporters who are, justifying or not taking seriously the violent cruelty done to the Israeli citizens too.
That's true. And I think, people have brought that up to me, like, why do I tend to talk more about why do I tend to be more critical of Israeli misbehavior than I do what Hamas did or something. And it's kind of just for the same reason that I spent a lot more time criticizing Abu Ghraib, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the torture scandal, than I did the behavior of Al Qaeda in Iraq. Like, those are not my people. Those people, they're going to do what they're going to do, and we have to deal with them on those terms. But the Israelis, this is a Western or Western adjacent society with deep ties to my own country that we, Osama bin Laden, when he took down the World Trade Center, a major part of the reason he gave for doing that was our support for Israel. And so this involves us in larger conflicts. And so these are our guys in a way. And so, and they're, look, I've been to Israel dozens of times and spent, I don't know, months at least there for sure. And I've been to the West Bank. I've never been to Gaza. But I know Israelis. I've spent time over there. And I love Israel. Israel and Israelis are great. They're some of my favorite people in the world. Very open, they're great. And the Israelis have built a great society over there for themselves, and to a very, slightly lesser extent for Israeli Arabs. And they deserve all the credit in the world for that, especially under the circumstances in which they did it. But to me, it means, like, okay, you're part of the first world kind of democratic club now. What you do reflects on all of us, including my own country, can bring violence on my own country. We understand that you're in a unique situation that none of us are facing, and you've got to deal with that. And we do give them leeway that we probably wouldn't even give our own soldiers, you know. And when the protests at the Gaza border fence started in 2018 and went on to 2019, Israeli snipers were given. These are unarmed people. It was a very clever tactic by Hamas and the leadership in Gaza. They said, what we're going to do is we're going to be unarmed, and our civilians, we're just going to walk, kind of like the Green March in Morocco back in 75. We're just going to walk up and walk through the border fence. And we don't, you know, we're going to just walk up to it unarmed, and the Israelis, we're going to see if they have the will to stop us. And Israeli snipers were given orders to shoot anyone that came within 300 meters of that fence, and they shot thousands and thousands of people. There's a video of a disabled man in a wheelchair being shot. There's kids, women, medics, journalists who were shot. Thousands of people. I mean, 6, 7, 8,000 people were shot by snipers, mind you. So this is not a missile blast or spraying machine gun fire. These are essentially executions. And I think if American troops were stationed in a war zone, like if American troops in Iraq were guarding Abu Ghraib prison, and the people in that prison, and they just, from 300 meters away, without taking a single casualty themselves, they shot several thousand unarmed people. I think if those were American soldiers, we would throw them in jail, and you know, it would be a huge stain. But we allow Israel some leeway because they're in a very unique situation, and so, you know, they do get that leeway, and yet that leeway can be abused, you know, and I would argue that it has been abused in many ways over the years, for reasons that, again, like, you know, I told an Israeli friend just the other day, he's like, well, what would you do, you know, if it were you? And I said, look, man, like, if I were the prime minister of Israel, I would probably make Netanyahu look like Mahatma Gandhi right now. But that's not a good reason that's not a justification for that kind of behavior. It's empathizing with it and understanding where it's coming from. But I'm not proud that I would respond that way. And, you know, so again, you know, the Israelis, it's totally true that all of these things exist in spades on the Palestinian side. But I just, the Palestinians are not my people in the same sense that the Israelis are, at least in a geopolitical way, you know?
Right. And but then it gets complicated because you've got, you know, Palestinian Christians who are united with Christian traditions, and they are being, you know, persecuted as well in this situation and turning the other cheek. And there's a kind of Christian solidarity that happens when you turn the other cheek as you're victimized by people killing people, like we saw with Justin Amash's relatives in this church.
Terrible.
In Gaza. So in that sense, they are, you know, that's the kind of, and I know you're kind of talking on different hats there, but if, you know, from a Christian standpoint, there's a kind of solidarity.
Yeah, no, that's totally true.
Victims.
That's 100% true. Yeah. And that's, you know, I found most people, they don't even realize, like, they think that because Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, which is what, if you're under, say, 30 or 40 years old, like, that's what you kind of know as the other side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They think of it as those groups, Iran and those groups, they frame it as a Muslim versus Jew conflict. And so people have this idea, I think, that it goes back thousands of years and it's this ancient, it's not, that's just not true. You know, I've got this photo from 1913, the year before the First World War broke out, of a band, a music band, on a stage at a cafe in Jaffa, I think it is. And there are two Christians, a Jew, and a Muslim in this band, as in 1913. And that was not considered strange at the time. I'm not gonna put frosting on the whole thing and say there was never any intercommunal conflict. There was, but in general, like this was not a big issue. This is something that has happened pretty recently in the last century or so, and up until the late 70s, early 80s. Palestinian Christians played, some of them were secular, but from Christian families, played a disproportionate role in the leadership of the Palestinian movement. The founder of the PFLP, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, George Habash, was a Palestinian Christian when he was 18 years old, he and his family were part of the death march that was forced out of the city of Lydda to walk through the desert to wherever they could end up. And that was the case because, the Palestinian Christians they tended to be more urban. They tended to have, just more organizational skills than like the Arab peasantry out in the countryside. And so they provided a disproportionate amount of the leadership. And it's really interesting, actually, because one of the things that the British did back in the 20s and 30s and that the Americans and the Israelis did in the 70s and 80s is actually protected and promoted Islamist groups because they wanted to drive a wedge between Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians, and they were successful, very successful, especially in the most recent version of that, where by turning it into a religious conflict, which it was not. It just was not a religion. In fact, even Yasser Arafat, after the Iranian Revolution, he went to Iran, and of course, the Ayatollah expressed all his support for the Palestinian cause and all this, but he was putting a huge amount of pressure on Arafat, and he did this for years, to make this into a religious war, to start talking about the Palestinian cause as a holy jihad and all that. And Arafat refused to do that. And he, this was not, it's not something that speaks well to his character or anything like that. It was just, he knew that like secularists and Palestinian Christians were hugely important to the movement at the time. And that was the case all the way up until, really the 80s. I mean, you can go read Israeli intelligence has, they protected Hamas because they thought that they would undermine the PLO, the Palestinian Authority rather. The Israeli right has common cause with Hamas in a certain sense, in that they both want to do whatever they have to do to prevent the implementation of a two-state solution. And, in fact, Netanyahu in a speech to the Knesset said, anybody who's against a two-state solution has to support Hamas. And he was telling his own people this.
Right.
And so, this is,
and his finance minister said something similar to the effect of, the PA is a liability and Hamas is an asset in the public opinion battle, right? Here, right?
Yeah, that's a hell of a quote.
So what that means, again, from the Christian anthropological framework, this speaks to what Gerard said, is this idea of victim power, right? Like, in order to sway the media narrative in our hyper digital online world with HD live streaming and instant reactions on social media and all this stuff that states are having a hard time keeping up with, the greatest narrative you can go for is, I am a victim, my people are victims, innocent victims of these people.
Yeah.
And Hamas is a much bigger victimizer from a narrative standpoint and a reality standpoint than the other factions that you were alluding to there, right? So,
yeah, they're hard to. They make themselves really hard to like. Let's just put it that way.
So, in this kind of hardball politics, Netanyahu has said that Hamas is, what they would prefer to have, not secular or Christian friendly, moderate or relatively moderate representation of the Palestinians, in terms of shaping the narrative discourse. Because, again, in a Christ haunted world, that which looks more like a sacrificial lamb is going to win the media war, right? And that's the rules that they have to play by. That wasn't the rules of the Roman Empire, was it? You're a historian. If you wanted to gain currency in the Roman Empire, did you have to show that you were the most victimized or bullied in a dispute?
No, of course not. Like,
So
you
what
can.
changed? I said that people don't, the elephant in the room, and you know it, but I keep focusing on this because it's everything, is the impact of Christianity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, 100%, I think. And the world is being Christianized to a degree, even when even in places where the faith itself is not spreading, in the
Right.
sense that this aspect of it is becoming. I mean, shoot, if you listen to a lot of conservative and Orthodox Jews, go listen to Dennis Prager or somebody, and other than like taking communion and whatever, like, he basically just sounds like a Christian. And that's a lot of people, secular people who have no religion, who are atheists. They're still basically Christian in their ethics. And that's spreading even to other countries, I think, where, there's like Francis Fukuyama likes to point out how, when he says the end of history and sort of having the final form of organization for human societies in liberal democratic capitalism, that he never meant that history was over or whatever, but just that, like, sure, there are other countries that don't do that kind of stuff. But if you look, even those countries, they feel a need to, like, at least wink at those values. They still
Right.
call themselves the People's Republic of, or the Democratic Republic of, or, they don't just say what the Romans would say when we call them out for human rights abuses, which is, yeah. And, they don't say that. They try to justify it in terms that are kind of that would be familiar to us. And so that is, so what I think what Francis Fukuyama maybe looks at as the spread of liberal democratic capitalism and stuff is really, to a large extent, it's the spread of Christian ethics around the world.
Right. And it's not just the Christian ethics, it's Christian aesthetics, it's Christian perception of the world, right? It's
Yeah.
seeing the world in your relationship to your neighbor, and the truth and history, and how to win a conflict with a rival through the framework of a Christ perceiving kind of framework. I mean, so I'm not going to say that the metaphysics of Christianity are superfluous by any means, but it's not just a side aspect of Christianity that's taking over the world. It is the
Right.
primary aspect of Christianity that's taking over the world, from the framework of, say, Saul being converted to Paul on the road to Damascus, right? It's this conversion experience in which he doesn't wake up and realize that he's been looking at dirty magazines, or, like moral majority type Christian framework. He doesn't wake up on the road to Damascus and realize he's been dabbling with gender confusion too long. He wakes up and realizes that he's a persecutor who is, in his zeal for who he conceives God to be, is killing innocent people. And therefore he's offered a radical message of forgiveness, where he doesn't have to offer any goats to the Christians to get forgiveness. He's just given forgiveness. And that kind of radical, alien apocalypse of religion is what's infecting the world now. And it's converting the world, right?
And it's what you hope. I mean, gosh, like, I remember, like I mentioned earlier, in 2014, when those 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped, tortured, brutally murdered by these animals, that there were marches, candlelight vigils, huge crowds in the West Bank of Palestinian Arabs who were holding vigils for those 3 dead boys. And at the time, I thought, okay, like, maybe this is like a sign that we're getting somewhere here, because these are 3 kids, innocent kids, who got killed, and that now maybe the other side is going to be able to look at this and say, is this what we've done? Is this what we've become? Maybe this will be a catalyst. It obviously hasn't turned out that way, unfortunately, but that's what we're kind of hoping for in this conflict, right? Is that eventually both sides, Palestinians and the Israelis, look at the situation. They look at it the way the Jews who converted looked at the cross. They looked at the whole situation. Maybe they were even involved in the mob that lynched Jesus. They may have been waving palm fronds a week before, but now they were baying for his blood along with everybody else, or denying him like Peter did. and they look up and they say, this was an innocent man, and we just lynched him for no good reason other than scapegoating. And it awakened people to that dynamic, and you would like to hope that that something like that could happen in this situation. Although, again, 1,400 murdered people and a lot of dead babies and elderly people and whatever doesn't seem to have moved supporters of the Palestinians 1 inch in that direction this time around. So you would kind of shudder to think what it might take.
Yeah, and it's again, these it takes radical mimetic role models, right? Modeling, right? Radical forgiveness, radical, and forgiveness does not entail, okay, the people who killed those children, you're fine. You can keep hanging out at the disco. No, it means no. We're going to practice self-defense and arrest and take out whoever was involved in this at every level, right? That's a Christian cultural way of dealing with crimes, not to punish and kill other people's babies because other people's babies were murdered. That doesn't solve the problem. It makes it worse. It makes more kids killed down the road. Every time you're killing babies now, more babies are going to be killed in the future, and on and on and on it goes.
That is Satan trying to cast out Satan.
Right. Yeah. And Satan has to pretend to look like a little lamb more and more, right? Satan's game's running out. Anthropologically, structurally, from a social standpoint, Satan is having to disguise himself more and more as a slain lamb to get his game going, right? And create the
that's
kind
so
of
true. Yeah, that's very well put. That's so true.
And
it does seem like he's getting a little more desperate, because he does seem to be bringing us up to a point of crisis here.
Right. And it seems to me that the biggest hurdle are a lot of the errors that still cloud, like you said, America or other folks in this conversation who, they're not imitating Jesus, or not even trying to imitate Jesus on this issue. They're just picking a football team, so to speak, and entrenching themselves in some kind of horrific social media Coliseum game, unfortunately, where it's like,
that's the terrible thing about it, is like, the most bloodthirsty people that you see on Twitter, they don't really feel that way. Right. They're contributing to this overall vibe that's intensifying polarization in every direction. But if you were to sit them down and be like, all right, here's this Palestinian woman, and her baby was buried in the rubble of this church that got bombed by the Israelis. They're not going to say to her, oh, well, I guess you should have thought about that when Hamas, they wouldn't do that. If confronted with it in real life, they would have empathy for that woman. They would weep with that woman. But our social relations and our political discourse and all that is not modulated or moderated by the real world anymore. It's moderated by this detached social media environment that kind of promotes the long distance sort of road rage mentality that, again, like road rage is a good example. I mean, people who are not violent people, they're perfectly peaceful people, can act like absolute lunatics in their cars just because it's different. It's detached, and you're right. Not dealing with people the same way. And man, that I mean, that has to be, right, like the biggest accelerant of not just this one, all of these political conflicts we've been seeing over the years, like the last several years. I mentioned earlier how back in 2014, the Israeli assault on Gaza was absolutely devastating. I mean, devastating. It was terrible. Whole sections of the city were just flattened. And, it was in the news. It was a worldwide story and all that. And there were some people who were upset about it or who were calling for ceasefires, but it was nothing compared to like it is now. And I have to imagine that social media is a huge part of that.
Right.
Which is not exactly a novel observation, I know, but
yeah, just there's a war, this media, or in the social media and the internet and smartphones, they're a double-edged sword, because I think at the same time that they do facilitate a base level of, vicarious detachment and detachment from the body, detachment from empathy, at the same time they accelerate those things, right? Because that's one of the reasons why the war propaganda is not cutting so smoothly this time, because people see victims in real time, horrific stuff on both sides in real time. And so the global village effect that McLuhan talks about and predicts, in a kind of prophetic way, is so alive more than ever. And it's accelerating the inability of governments to be able to keep their mythic framework alive, right? Because you need to have somewhat unanimity to create the mythology that justifies you to mow down other people's kids and stuff. And when that can be exposed in real time outside of the media gatekeepers of a couple newspaper syndicates or a couple TV networks, now you have victim solidarity and empathy pathways opening up all over the place with these decentralized node networks in a way that's explosive to the ability of these 20th century state structures to maintain their power. So this is truly the gospel technology. I call the gospel technology what you were talking about, showing the side of the victim. If you see the victim and you have to, hey, let he who is out sin cast the first stone. Can you kill this person yourself, or do you just cheer it on vicariously on social media? Social media has a way of kind of showing us the victim at the same time. And that's unraveling states from maintaining their ability to keep narratives, the way they want them, which is going to at the same time escalate, right, some of the viciousness that people are going to say to try to create the same effect that would have worked in the previous past times, right, when the media was more controlled and centralized. So gospel technology, which is using any kind of technology, including speech and person, but any type of technology to bear witness to a victim, is accelerated in its effect by the development of technology. So the more you can see HD live streaming and audio, and every poor person in the world theoretically could have access to this technology and to show their side of the story and their suffering, that is gospel technology spreading that much more powerfully. So gospel technology works through media development. What's that?
And it's become like a primary strategic consideration for states and militant groups and just actors of all kinds around the world. It's become a major strategic consideration to figure out how to manipulate and mobilize those dynamics in favor of their own cause, right? I mean, we saw it just in hyperdrive in a way that was much more unanimous than we're seeing right now with this issue with when Russia invaded Ukraine. All of a sudden,
right,
within days, you had individuals, corporations, sports associations, just all of these things spontaneously coalesced into an anti-Russian sort of coalition and began imposing penalties and sanctions on Russia that were in excess of the sanctions that were being required by law by the US or other NATO countries. And it wasn't the head of the CIA wasn't getting on the phone with the president of the tennis association and the CEO. They weren't doing that. It was all something that happened on the fly without top-down organization. And you had this global swarm, this global mob that mobilized itself against a nuclear power, which is interesting because this is the first time we've seen these networked swarms mobilize for causes or against individuals when people get scapegoated and canceled or something. And
right,
but gradually they're coming into conflict with larger and larger let's say entities that have an actual means to defend themselves. And the Russian example was the first time that they took on a nation state. I guess maybe you could sort of say they took on a nation state with South Africa, but that was still much more of a top-down thing. That wasn't like a spontaneously organizing movement so much. And these mobs don't respond well when they don't get their way, and they they tend to go looking for other victims.
Right.
I always say that the Spirit of the Lord abides in individuals, but the devil moves in crowds.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's why the devil is the prince of this world. It's why he rules politics. Politics is all it's crowd dynamics, it's mass dynamics, and the devil is in control in those situations. That is his element. And until you can get people to view the other side in a conflict as individuals and not as members of the other group primarily, then you're never going to de-escalate these things until one side achieves just such a dominant victory that the other side can't do anything about it. And that's the challenge. That's the thing I tried to do with my podcast series on the origin of this conflict. It's what I try to do on Twitter. People on both sides get angry with me because the people who are hardcore partisans of either side, they don't want people learning more about the other side's position. They don't actually want that. People who are hardcore pro-Zionist types, they don't want to talk about the things that the Israelis and the Zionists before the state of Israel was founded did to the Palestinians to get where they are today. The Palestinians, they don't want to hear about the things that have, that have happened from their side. But, when they do, when people who are open-minded do hear the other side's perspective, they tend to open up. And that's not something that, Hamas or extremist Zionists or their partisans overseas really want.
But you're part of and others are part of this kind of myth-making demystification on steroids that's taking place. I mean, the fact that an 8th grader, no matter who they are, no matter how much wealth they have, if they know English, I don't even know if that's a barrier these days, can go on to your podcast and learn about the truth of this conflict as objective as one can try to be, as you're trying to be. See, that goes back to this kind of Christian unveiling, right, of how things are. Christianity is what creates this concept of a future where we can go somewhere. History is going somewhere. But in order to go somewhere, Christianity also has to create history in sense of a vocation that you're called to, right? Not that you can always point to, but Christians are biased. Of course they are, right? But Christianity is what creates the standard by which we, if we're sober-minded and actually imitating Jesus, can tell the truth about events in history in an attempt to be as objective and nonpartisan and unemotional in terms of being driven by the passions, such that you don't tell the truth of the full accounting of the mimetic rivalries of history. And what you're doing on your podcast is an attempt to fulfill the vocation, the Christian vocation of proper history. As biased as humans can be, you still have to strive towards that standard. And as that continues to happen in this decentralized, I mean, just think about it. I mean, Darryl, these conflicts were happening in the 80s and 90s. They couldn't access a podcast like yours or mine at the age of, that wasn't available. You had to hear what the highly manipulated, top-down oligarchic media wanted you to know about a situation, right? You didn't get to hear someone who's like, I'm not selling you Raytheon interest. I'm just a guy here just looking at the facts as best as we can ascertain them with all the bias that goes into primary sources even and so forth. But, trying to sort through all the mess and make an accounting of the victims. And this is precisely what Jesus predicts. You're mentioning his journey into Jerusalem. I mean, he says there, you're talking about the crowd and the possession of it being of the devil. But he says, I mean, they're trying to tell his supporters to be quiet, and he tells them, tells the religious figures, when these are silent, the stones will cry out. He's talking about, he's actually quoting a prophet, Habakkuk chapter 2, in which Habakkuk is challenging and condemning a wicked king of his day, and it says the stones of the walls cry out. It's referring to immurement. It's referring to the practice of entombing humans alive in the structures of temples and cities and walls that would be built, like in Jericho, where, the Bible says at the cost of your firstborn, this walls would be built, the gates. This idea of immurement is something that scandalizes Jesus's opponents. They're like, well, we don't do that kind of stuff. Well, yeah, you do. And the way you act and the way you treat people, you're just like your people who you think you're not like. And what Jesus is predicting is like, when this crowd's silent, the stones will cry out. People used to think that's like, Sunday school zippity doodah where the rocks are singing, like the flowers, some kind of a psychedelic Hercules, stunt he's talking about. No, he's talking about what Habakkuk was talking about, that the hidden victims, the structural victims of the walls of this city and every other place around the world will be heard when this crowd who's cheering my name now turns their back on me in a week when I go to my passion, right? So if you read on in that Habakkuk prophecy that the Habakkuk portion that he's talking about, it says that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the ocean is wet.
Mm.
And that's precisely what's been happening for 2,000 years since that event that Jesus predicted would happen. That's exactly what happened. The structural victims of the walls of every city before him and after him their voices are being heard because of him being expelled in that moment as a representation of all of humanity expelling him. And in expelling him, it unveils the hidden victims of our walls today. So we're a part of this. It's pretty electric, man. I mean, if you really, really put it out there, it's pretty mesmerizing and like breathtaking to think about, because we're living in this history process. And it's because of the gospel's relationship to media technology, because media technology continues to innovate and develop at like exponential rates in terms of chips and costs and portability and all these different things. It's going to accelerate that knowledge of the Lord filling the earth as the ocean is wet at a level we can't even fathom from those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s.
It's like you said too, that the technology has a dual effect of accelerating scapegoating behavior to a level we've never seen before, and yet making it easier to expose victims as victims in real time. And I think when both of those things are happening at the same time, it's going to be destabilizing. And so we're definitely living through history, and yeah, it's not through with us yet.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time, Darryl. It's always a pleasure. And man, what a great discussion. Thank you for what you're doing, trying to, be a role model for level-headedness and trying to get the facts straight about these different contentious, emotionally charged issues.
Yeah, thanks, man. The sort of guiding principle of my podcast and everything I try to do is to show people who are listening that in almost every situation, maybe not when you're talking about Ted Bundy or something, whatever, but in pretty much every historical situation or current event situation, that these are just people involved. And you might be people like Hamas who have surrendered your humanity, and to your hatred. But if you go to the West Bank and I mean, shoot, Justin Amash had family in Gaza, that these are just people. When you sit down and talk to them, they're just people like you and me. And once you can recognize that and start seeing that in other groups that tend to get turned into mythological hate figures, that's, yeah, it's I mean, the what Christianity allows us to recognize ourselves as victimizers, and to know when we are acting as part of a mob, and that's the one thing we should never do. you have one guiding principle in your life: never allow yourself to be involved in a mob. Maybe you agree with the mob and you can express those feelings individually, whatever, but don't involve yourself with a mob, even if it's a distributed mob like on the internet.
Right. Very well said. It reminds me when I went to that region, I went to Bethlehem and I was hanging out with a guy who was doing, woodworking and stuff. And it was a little shop to sell things to tourists, of course. But I was getting to talk to him for a little bit one-on-one for a while. And he was telling me, he said, I'm a Christian and I've lived here, family, generations. But you see that hill over there, that's Jerusalem. And I'm not allowed to go over there and see where my Savior walked and to walk on his footsteps, even though I've been here for generations. And there's nothing like hearing that, a fellow Christian that can really cut through all the bombast and noise and confusion of cable news programs and televangelists. So to cut through the truth, the solidarity of people are just people. And especially when they're viewed as persons rather than, members of a collective. Really brings out the humanity.
It's been great talking to you, man. I always appreciate your perspective.
Yeah, same with you. And check out the Martyr Made podcast. And if you'd like to stay in touch with us at A Neighbor's Choice, you can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.